Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm the director of the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today to discuss how ballet transformed from a former court art into an art form for the mass Soviet audience. A few preliminary remarks. I encourage everyone to stay up to date with the Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcast, Kennan X and the Russia File. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis on events in Ukraine. Finally, I would like to take this moment to thank the Department of State's Title VIII program for their generous support of several of the Kennan Institute's fellowships, which has allowed us to host rising scholars in the field, including our guest today, Singh. If you have any questions today for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event, and we will move to your questions following the presentation. I would like to begin by introducing our speaker and then give her the opportunity to deliver her remarks. Singh is a dance scholar and historian of Soviet cultural life. Her first book project illuminates the processes through which Soviet artists and officials transformed ballet, an art form intimately associated with the Russian imperial family, into a form of socialist popular culture intended to nurture for Soviet citizens and to build socialism. Dr. Singh earned her PhD in modern Russian history from the University of California, Riverside in June 2021. Lee, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you all for being here. On April 19th, 1932, a group of theater critics, dancers, choreographers, stage directors, screenwriters, bureaucrats, and others, including a composer, a poet, a neurologist, a journal editor, and an actor-reciter, gathered in the Beethoven Hall at the Bolshoi Theater. Their ostensible purpose was to discuss a competition among composers and librettists for the creation of a new ballet in honor of the 15th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution and the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Union. One of the speakers was Bolshoi theater dancer and assistant superintendent of the Bolshoi Ballet Company, Mikhail Gabovich. Now, at these kinds of meetings, people spoke at some length, so what I'm going to show is just a very brief excerpt of Gabovich's remarks, during which he was interrupted a couple of times. The thing is that the libretti they are giving us to produce are phenomenally unsuitable. They are a rehashing of everything old without consideration for ballet's capabilities. I can give you an anecdotal example of the kind of libretti that we've received. Such libretti can only ruin ballet theater and not help it achieve its proper eminence. So, for example, they compose a libretto like this. A Soviet ship is docked in Odessa, and there a Soviet sailor dives down to the ocean floor. Diving down to the Soviet ocean floor, he meets a mermaid. A Soviet mermaid. A rebellion ensues in the underwater kingdom against the king of the Mer people. Therefore, the sailor, of course, can't pass by this insurrection indifferently, and he helps dethrone the king of the Mer people, and so on. It's just an anecdotal example, but we have a lot of this type of libretto. I love this moment in the stenographic record because of the interruptions and because it encapsulates the challenges of repurposing ballet, an art form that had developed over centuries in the context of European courts, into an instrument for the political education and enlightenment of mass audiences in the world's first socialist country. Pre-revolutionary ballets had depicted mermaids, no problem. 19th century ballets were famous for underwater kingdoms, ghostly woods, opium dreams, and spectral visions. Ballet dancers, choreographers, and designers could definitely depict mermaids. But could ballet mermaids embody socialist revolution? Should they? Gabovich was certainly skeptical. My talk today is based on the 4th chapter of my first book project, tentatively entitled Ballet for Socialism's Sake, The Red Poppy at the Bolshoi Theater, 1927 to 1960. In the larger project, I argue that Soviet artists and officials transformed ballet, an art form intimately associated with the Russian imperial family and European courts of centuries past, into a form of socialist popular culture. I show how ballet's popularity in the Soviet Union was the result of a combination of audience development strategies and changes in the art itself. Archival sources reveal that Soviet artists exercised their professional expertise and agency in the development of ballet as an art form intended for the enjoyment and edification of mass audiences. The sources for this chapter mainly consist of stenographic records of meetings and debates that were held in Moscow. These discussions brought together a wide range of professionals who were interested in the future of Soviet ballet. In chronological order, the meetings include the debate on the ways forward for Soviet ballet, 1932, so that's where Gabovich's remarks came from, a dance conference, 1933, the All-Union Dance Conference, 1936, and a meeting at the Bolshoi Theater about ballet issues that featured comments from the chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs in 1937. Meetings in Soviet institutions often included a stenographer who recorded the participants' remarks and discussion. The stenographic records were often typed, duplicated, and circulated to the participants and other interested parties. Speakers were sometimes allowed to correct their remarks. Eventually, the stenographic records were archived, often with institutional records and sometimes with personal papers. Of course, the stenographic records cannot be assumed to be exhaustive transcripts. Even if imperfect, historical actors' voices come through especially strongly in the stenographic records, and the stenographic records offer valuable insights into contemporary debates. In this chapter, largely on the basis of these stenographic records, I argue that socialist realism in ballet was not dictated from above or micromanaged by the newly created All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs. The priorities and forms of Soviet ballet developed along paths that were worked out in practice and through discussions that engaged artists themselves. Officials who were not practicing artists participated in many of these discussions, but they acknowledged and sought artists' expertise in determining what kinds of stories Soviet ballet should tell, how those stories needed to be structured, and with what physical language Soviet ballet should incorporate its stories. Critically, the discussions reveal that the pedagogical imperative for Soviet arts was a shared goal of both officials and artists. Participants in these discussions often disagreed about how to achieve the goal of making ballets that would be politically educational and enlightening for mass audiences. But the pedagogical mission was not one of the points of disagreement. I maintain that adapting a pre-revolutionary art form for the Soviet pedagogical imperative was a fundamentally creative process that engaged the professional expertise of dancers, choreographers, stage directors, and other artists. These discussions challenge assumptions that situate the Soviet state in opposition to artists. Rather, the discussions show how artists exercised agency, even in the 1930s, when the state was at its most violently interventionist. Taken together, the discussions illuminate how characteristics of Soviet ballet were developed in conversation with professionals, not mandated to resistant artists. Thus, they also show that socialist realism in ballet, far from squashing all creativity, was generative. I will start by defining some terms and assumptions. In the early Soviet period, ballet and other art forms were tasked with what I call a pedagogical imperative. The Soviet government and Communist Party invested significant human, financial, and other material resources in artistic production for the purposes of politically educating and enlightening mass audiences. In exchange for those resources, artists were supposed to create literature, plays, music, visual arts, films, operas, and ballets that showed audiences how to understand their present and how to build a better future. In the 1930s, the pedagogical imperative went hand in hand with the concept of kulturnist. Vadim Volkov explains that early understandings of kulturnist incorporated habits of dress, personal hygiene, diet, table manners, speech, and the organization and equipment of living and working spaces. In the mid-1930s, kulturnists came to include the consumption of officially approved literature, music, and other works of artistic production. As Volkov observes, to become a cultured person, one must have read classical literature, contemporary Soviet fiction, poetry, newspapers, works by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, as well as have attended the cinema and exhibitions with the purpose of self-education. In addition to current events, political texts, literatures, cinema, and visual arts, ballet and opera were forms of culture that Soviet officials sponsored and disseminated for inclusion in what Volkov terms Soviet people's common cultural horizon. Soviet leaders assumed that citizens with an unimpeded grasp of the common cultural horizon would be willing and able to successfully build the world's first socialist society. Also in the early 1930s, socialist realism emerged as the official approach to artistic production. The concept gained momentum in 1934 with the first Soviet Writers' Congress. though many of the ideas that shaped initial definitions of socialist realism were circulating among artists before any official pronouncements in the name of socialist realism. In his address to the Writers' Congress, Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Andrei Zhdanov, proclaimed that Soviet literature should depict reality in its revolutionary development in order to effect the ideological remolding and education of the toiling people in the spirit of socialism. Soviet leaders and artists conceived of socialist realism as an artistic approach that would serve the pedagogical, kulturist-enhancing mission of Soviet arts. As Zhdanov said, Soviet artists were responsible for creating works from which the people of our times can learn. But it's important to keep in mind that socialist realism was rarely methodically prescribed by non-artist officials. One way that socialist realism was typically defined was in terms of general principles. Three of the characteristics of socialist realist art were narodnost, idealist, and partiynost. Narodnost was the quality of being of the people or for the people. Art characterized by narodnost was supposed to be comprehensible to mass audiences and may have been based on folk sources. Idealist meant that art was imbued with ideological content. Art characterized by idealist was not simply entertainment. Neither was art characterized by idealist the result of an individual artist's experiments with formal properties of artistic composition. So that might have been what is termed art for art's sake in the West, and at the time in the Soviet Union, that kind of experimentation was defined as formalism. Art suffused by idealists would be able to contribute to audiences' political education. Partiynost described art that was saturated with the spirit of the Communist Party or the party's current ideological priorities. Because these principles were quite vague, artists in some genres, including ballet, exercised considerable agency and creativity in working out how the general principles could be incorporated into artistic practice. I find evidence of artists' agency and creativity in various discussions about Soviet ballet. In the 1930s, the discussions boiled down to three main questions. What subjects are appropriate for Soviet ballets? How should Soviet ballets be structured? And with what embodied methods should Soviet ballet tell its stories? I will share some highlights from the discussions of each of these questions. One of the most pressing questions at the meetings about Soviet ballet in the 1930s was the question of subject matter. In April 1932, even before the first formal speeches and publications about socialist realism, Bolshoi theater dancer Irina Chernotskaya advocated for staging ballets about Soviet women as she should be, not as she was, and certainly not as female characters had been in classical ballets or in early Soviet ballets, such as Red Poppy and The Soccer Player. Chernotskaya's remarks connected the choice of subject matter directly to ballet's pedagogical imperative in the Soviet Union. She said, "We should agitate from the stage. We have ideas about how people should be, and we should campaign for those ideas from the stage." The question was, what subjects were appropriate for Soviet ballets? Most of the themes proposed for Soviet ballets can be sorted into four categories: contemporary Soviet reality, legends and folklore, historical events, and literary sources. Many of the participants in the meetings and debates in the 1930s agreed that Soviet ballets should depict contemporary Soviet characters in realistic situations. Stage director Boris Matvinov offered a lengthy list of potential subjects for ballets: the heroic battle and revolutionary romanticism of the Civil War, the ardor of construction, the birth of the new person, forging, new people, new society, new way of life, celebrations of victory and meeting heroes, our youth and its explosive flowering, the heroic struggle of the proletariat, and the mission and friendship of the peoples of the Soviet Union. Actor and reciter Immanuel Kaminka also suggested the following themes from contemporary Soviet life: the creative initiative of millions of Soviet people, classless society, the relationship to labor, the pioneers, and the moving efforts of the Komsomol. Dancer Irina Chernotskaya proposed a ballet about the unveiling of Muslim women. The chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs in 1937, Platon Kerzhentsev, summarized his recommendations for ballets in Soviet themes, which included Soviet people from the Caucasus and Uzbekistan, folk dance, fizkultura, youth, defense, and vigilance against foreign or domestic forces that might try to undermine socialist construction. Kerzhentsev emphasized that contemporary subject matter was really the most appropriate subject matter for Soviet ballets. However, some participants thought that other subjects would be just as good or better. Comrade Galitsky from Kiev thought that ballet did not necessarily need to take its settings from everyday life in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, so long as ballet put human experience, as he put it, the truth of life, at its center, and to this end, he suggested that folk tales would be useful subject matter. Historical events were another primary alternative to settings in contemporary Soviet society. Dancer Mikhail Gabovich submitted a libretto on Ivan Bolotnikov and the peasant armies who had attempted to overthrow the Muscovite Tsar in the early 17th century. The third significant alternative to contemporary events was literary sources. This alternative arose in practice in the early 1930s, with ballets such as The Flames of Paris, 1932, and The Fountain of Bakhchisarai, 1934. Both of these ballets were originally staged in Leningrad, with music by Boris Asafiev and libretti by Nikolai Volkov. And in both cases, the libretti were at least loosely based on literary works. In 1937, dancer Mikhail Gabovich pressed for the inclusion of classical literature as source material for ballets, particularly plays by William Shakespeare, Lope de Vega, Molière, and Nikolai Gogol. A meeting between Bolshoi theater staff and All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs Chairman Kirshentsov in October 1937 yielded what was probably the first officially promulgated list of suggested themes for Soviet ballets. After the meeting, Kirshentsov followed up with a memorandum to the Bolshoi theater, reiterating the 4 categories of themes. The first priority was contemporary Soviet subject matter. Historical themes were a distant second priority, followed by folk tales and fantasy, then works of classical literature. The All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs had been formed almost 2 years earlier. After 2 years, it issued a list of subject matter priorities for Soviet ballet. And importantly, the list included many of the themes put forward by artists themselves at the meetings over the previous 5 years. This suggests that priorities for Soviet ballet in the 1930s were not mandated to resistant professionals, but developed in conversation with professional ballet and theater workers. However, having an appropriate subject was not sufficient to guarantee that a libretto would yield a ballet at one of the Soviet state theaters. Libretti on perfectly acceptable subjects were routinely rejected if their content or structure seemed not to be conducive to expression in the non-verbal genre of ballet. Libretti that were rejected often centered on ideas that could not be represented in ballet's physical vocabulary, lacked opportunities for dancing, took the form of episodes or divertissement, consisted of only one or too few concrete ideas or scenes, allegedly distorted historical events, and/or failed to balance positive heroes with sympathetic portrayals of the masses. Therefore, I infer that libretti for Soviet ballet were expected to be comprised of danceable or mimeable themes, to include dramatically justified opportunities for dancing, to be organized by a strong dramaturgical concept, to consist of multiple coherently sequenced scenes, to be deemed historically accurate, and to incorporate both positive heroes and favorable characterizations of the masses. Minutes from meetings of the Bolshoi Theater's Ballet Repertoire Commission, a subset of the Bolshoi Theater's Artistic Political Council, and similar gatherings to discuss libretti submitted for possible production at the Bolshoi Theater, contain comments from participants regarding what they found promising and unpromising in the submitted libretti, discussions of possible revisions that could make the libretti suitable for production at the Bolshoi Theater, and negotiations toward consensus on how the Bolshoi Theater should reply to librettists regarding the future of their submissions. In addition to meeting minutes, the theater's archive contains a few draft rejection letters prepared by Bolshoi Theater employees. These sources offer insight into contemporary understandings of what attributes of plot structure artists and producers sought in ballet libretti. By way of illustration, here are 4 proposed ballets on solidly contemporary or historical revolutionary subjects that were rejected for dramaturgical reasons. The Bolshoi Theater's Artistic Political Council Repertoire Commission met in January 1930 to discuss a proposed ballet libretto called The Mountains Were Moved. The ballet would ostensibly have been about the construction of socialism in Central Asia, a contemporary Soviet theme. However, among its many weaknesses, the commission determined that the libretto lacked opportunities for dancing. 19th century ballets usually contained a wedding, an engagement party, a ball, harvest celebration, or other pretexts for dancing. While these ballets were sometimes criticized in the 1930s for having plots that were too thin or for lacking an appropriate ideological message, most contributors to the 1930s debates about the future of Soviet ballet assumed that Soviet ballets should incorporate dance. However, librettists who were not used to working in the genre of ballet tended not to understand dance scenes as a fundamental requirement of a ballet production. So a lot of ballet libretti were rejected because they didn't offer opportunities for dancing. In February 1932, the Bolshoi Theater rejected a libretto about the French Revolution entitled Freedom, Equality, and Fraternity. There were 3 primary reasons for this libretto's rejection. It could not be conveyed through embodied means, it lacked a dramaturgical through line, and it distorted its historical subject matter. The theater's draft rejection letter noted that the libretto was unsuitable because it called for written inscriptions during the performance, which would defeat the purpose of ballet, a genre in which the content should be communicated without words. The rejection letter also criticized the libretto's episodic form. The events of the story did not seem dramatically justified or connected. Further, the dancers and choreographers thought that the story of the main character's romantic relationship caused an unacceptable distortion in the ballet's portrayal of the French Revolution. Thus, while freedom, equality, and fraternity had a historical and revolutionary subject, the structure of the libretto was not deemed suitable for the ballet stage. In November 1936, Deputy Chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs, Yakov Boyarsky, reported that someone had suggested to him a ballet about the International Folk Dance Festival, which had been held in London in 1935. Boyarsky said that this happened a lot. People suggested an episode rather than a full narrative, and one scene was not enough to make a ballet. During a meeting in October 1937, Chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs, Platon Kerzhentsev, offered comments on dancer Mikhail Gabovich's libretto about the Bolotnikov rebellion. Kerzhentsev thought that while Gabovich's libretto did show the masses in a positive light, the masses were undifferentiated and lacked individuals with whom Bolotnikov's character could relate. Gabovich's hero, Bolotnikov, was consequently isolated from the masses and seemed dwarfed by them. Kerzhentsev's evaluation spoke to the challenges of balancing positive heroes and representations of the masses. All of these examples had appropriate subjects. There were historical themes, the French Revolution and the Bolotnikov Rebellion, and contemporary themes, building socialism in Central Asia and the Folk Dance Festival. But in these cases, the subject matter was not enough. Ballet libretti with good subject matter also needed to be centered on ideas that could be expressed in dance or gesture, to offer dramatically justified occasions for dancing, to have a firm dramaturgical concept that could be developed throughout the duration of the performance, to be historically accurate, and to serve as instruments for the political education and enlightenment of mass audiences by presenting positive heroes and sympathetic portrayals of the masses. Balancing all of these concerns about appropriate subjects and crafting stories that were danceable and gave characters reasons to dance while also featuring positive heroes and productive masses and well-justified plot structures was no simple task. Perhaps unsurprisingly, between their verbal participation in meetings and the proposed libretti that they wrote, dancers and choreographers contributed the clearest articulations of what could and could not be produced in Soviet ballet. By October 1937, the chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs, Kerzhentsev, decided that there was not much point in trying to engage outsiders in the early stages of libretto development for ballet. Efforts to cultivate ballet librettists from the general public through open competitions and among professional writers, especially poets and playwrights, had not yielded many viable libretti. Kerzhentsev noted that the libretti at the Bolshoi theater's dancers had submitted were already more promising than the libretti coming from other sources. He recommended that dancers and choreographers themselves compose libretti and suggested engaging professional dramaturgs or other literary specialists only later in the production process. This recommendation highlights ballet's unique requirements as a genre. Kerzhentsev recognized that the ballet professionals embodied vital expertise when it came to plotting ballet stories. Assuming an appropriate subject was selected and a plot on that subject developed, questions remained about how Soviet ballet stories should be told. For the sake of time today, I'm going to focus on discussions about whether or not to incorporate classical ballet technique in Soviet ballet. There were plenty of discussions about whether ballet dancing could be socialist and/or realist. A number of participants in the debates of the 1930s argued that classical ballet technique should be abandoned entirely because there was no way that existing ballet technique could be used to tell socialist stories. Comrade Tikhonov objected to the verticality of classical ballet technique, the depersonalized unison of corps de ballet choreography, the emotional facial expressions dancers use to convey their characters' feelings, and technical aspects such as the positions croisées, which he deemed more suitable to Christian religious propaganda than socialist agitation. Another dissenting voice came from Comrade Shapovalova, who argued that classical ballet technique did not train the entire body and was therefore unsuitable as the basis for socialist dance. Shapovalova asserted that classical ballet training bore within itself class content that was alien to Soviet Russia in the 1930s, embodied relics of ballet's court past, and that there was therefore no way to repurpose the dance lexicon and training methodology for socialist art because the form of the dance technique would always be at odds with the ballet's socialist subject matter. Professor Isak Turkeltaub contended that classical ballet technique was unsalvageable because of its past application to tell non-Soviet stories. He did not think that Soviet audiences would be able to see ballet as communicating anything other than the limited repertoire of stories and themes cultivated in 19th century Romantic and classical ballets. Similarly, choreographer Kasyan Golozovsky lamented the bourgeois pirouette style of classical ballet that dishonors and defiles Soviet subject matter in the ballet The Bright Stream. All of these participants argued that ballet's physical language was an anachronism, that the way the bodies were trained and presented in classical ballet could not be repurposed to tell Soviet stories. However, there were many participants who did think that classical ballet technique could be repurposed to serve Soviet objectives. Stage director Boris Montvinov proclaimed that under no circumstances should the language of classical ballet not be used. It will never be possible to create Soviet ballet that isn't based on ballet of the past. Similarly, dancer-choreographer Igor Moiseyev argued that we should use this technique not for its own sake, but as a means of expression. Contrary to Turkeltaub's pessimism about repurposing ballet, dancer Irina Chornotskaya expressed optimism that ballet could be reinflected with new meanings in the Soviet context. She made an analogy with visual arts. In painting, which advances very quickly, we see the same 7 colors. In ballet, we have the same sort of movements. Maybe we should select from these same movements and compose different combinations. From the same jumps, these elevated jumps, we need to give powerful jumps to create the image of a strong woman who does not need rescuing by some romantic hymn from some sort of it. Chornotskaya suggested that if painters could take just a few colors and create all sorts of different styles of painting, surely classical ballet technique, which had embodied scenarios with kings and queens, could now be used to body forth Soviet ideals. She maintained that ballet should offer audiences characters whom Soviet audiences should want to emulate, including strong heroines. To represent strong Soviet women, Chornotskaya reasoned that a ballerina should be able to utilize Pointe turns. Let her spin Pointe turns. This will demonstrate her strength. Wojciechowicz, Turkeltaub, Shapovalova, and Golozovsky saw in the embodiment of classical ballet technique only the relics of aristocratic and bourgeois cultures. Chornotskaya saw the potential to imbue ballet technique with a new range of meanings that could incorporate socialist ideas. But then there was the issue of realism. Could ballet be realistic? Turkeltaub contended that classical ballet vocabulary could not be used to stage a realistic production on any subject, whether the theme was Soviet or not. Comrade Andreev, a theater scholar, opined that he would not be convinced by a milkmaid standing on Pointe, that such a movement would not be natural for her. He strongly objected to the scene in The Bright Stream where the ballerina from the city arrives at the collective farm and begins to dance in a field strewn with stubble after the harvest. Here, the debate turned on different standards of realism. No, ballet could not be used to present a precise rendering of agricultural labor. Ballet was not documentary film or photography or even realist painting. But ballet could be used to express the emotions of agricultural laborers and Komsomol members who found their work fulfilling. The debate came back around to dramaturgical conception and coherence. Some participants reasoned that if the plot justified the emotions, then ballet could be the means of emotional expression. Deputy Chairman of the All-Union Committee for Artistic Affairs, Yakov Boyarsky, maintained that the question was not whether a milkmaid should or should not stand on Pointe. He argued that if a dramatic situation arose when a milkmaid's mental state justified her dancing on Pointe, then she could dance on Pointe. The important thing was that there be a dramatic justification for dancing on Pointe, or doing fouettes. Theater critic and stage director Pavel Markov believed similarly that it would be perfectly acceptable for a Komsomol girl to rise onto her toes in delight and express her feelings with the means of classical steps. He made an analogy between singing in opera and dancing in ballet. Both were means of scenic expression to be accepted and justified in their application to communicate edifying stories for Soviet audiences. To sum up, the question of with what means Soviet ballet should tell its stories was one of the most fervently debated issues in the discussions in the 1930s. There were arguments that classical ballet technique was intrinsically antagonistic to Soviet ideals because of the physical carriage of dancers' bodies. Speakers who wanted to desert ballet technique often contended that new ways of moving and dancing would develop if choreographers were challenged to tell Soviet stories without resorting to classical ballet steps, jumps, and positions. Shapovalova advocated for reforming dance training first. She meant that they should abolish ballet technique entirely in order to generate a new dance vocabulary that would be suited for demonstrating contemporary political ideas. In Shapovalova's words, ballet dramaturgy will not save the situation. Other speakers expressed the belief that dramaturgy was, in fact, the answer. They countered that as long as Soviet ballets had appropriate stories, ballet technique could be used to express joy, agony, and a whole range of human emotions that would be part of Soviet story ballets. Consequently, they argued, there was no need to abandon ballet technique. Ballet technique needed to be put to use to tell Soviet stories. To this point, librettist Nikolai Volkov cited the example of choreographer Vasily Vainonin's use of a ballerina character in The Flames of Paris. Volkov asserted that the ballerina's solo dance on Pointe conveyed true agony, and that over the course of the whole ballet, her character embodied the transition of the intelligentsia from one revolutionary camp to the other. Volkov defended Vainonin's use of ballet technique on the grounds of ballet technique's capacity to reveal a character's emotions without words. In conclusion, discussions about making ballet Soviet in the 1930s reveal that many of the principles that came to define socialist realism in ballet practice were suggested by or worked out in conversation with professional artists. These discussions also reveal that the artists supported the pedagogical imperative for Soviet arts. Far from resisting this duty, artists applied their professional expertise to the creative challenges of selecting appropriate subject matter, structuring dramaturgically sound plots, and developing methods for embodied storytelling. In other words, Soviet artists and officials shared the goal of making ballet more accessible to and educational for mass audiences. And choreographers and dancers, including women, exercised agency in the development of ballet as a Soviet art form. I argue that transforming an art form of the imperial court into a form of socialist popular culture was a fundamentally creative endeavor. In my larger project, I argue that the pedagogical imperative, which certainly foreclosed some types of ballet production, also catalyzed artist creativity. In ballet, socialist realism was generative. Soviet ballet incorporated new types of characters and concepts that had not been embodied in ballet in Russia before the revolutions. Socialist realism was not, for the most part, embodied by Mermaid Revolutionaries. But socialist realism did compel choreographers and dancers to incorporate serious subject matter, characters from literary classics, contemporary Soviet youth, and heroes and heroines from history and legend. Choreographers and dancers worked out new methods of corporeal storytelling to go with this new subject matter. And the resultant ballets were very popular with Soviet audiences. Thus, the pedagogical imperative brought about the conditions of possibility for Soviet artists and officials to transform ballet into a form of popular culture. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Lee. Just a reminder, if you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event, and we'll move to your questions following in a short while. So this is a fascinating description as to how the Soviet Union tried to adapt a bourgeois, suitably bourgeois form of art into Soviet. You mentioned about the collaborative efforts, but I'm curious if you could talk about who was excluded in these discussions. Obviously, in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of people were not part of this debate. So when you talk about how it was kind of professionals and choreographers and dancers and so forth, was there attempts to exclude certain people from this debate as to what should be Soviet ballet?
Thank you. That's a really good question. It's a little bit hard to tell based on my source base who was excluded, because the sources tell who was there. They tell who was participating, who spoke at the meetings, but they don't tell who wasn't there. So I know I can derive maybe from other sources who the other dancers in the company were. So some of them were participating in these meetings, not all of them were participating in the meetings. But I can't tell why they weren't participating. Like, I haven't found a list of people who were not supposed to be coming or anything like that. So I don't know to what extent there were some dancers who just were not particularly interested, or they had family commitments, they had other priorities. So it's hard to tell based on the sources that I have who was actively excluded. I can more likely tell who wasn't there, but not who was being actively not allowed to come.
Thanks. A brief follow-up question. When this new Soviet ballet was performed in the West, what was the reaction? Was it perceived as a new art form, talking about socialist realism and different types of history, or was it perceived as overtly political? And I'm kind of interested not only kind of the general ballet community, but the Russian ballet community that was in exile. Did they accept that this was a new standard form of ballet, or was there a reaction to it, positive or negative?
Wow. My research is focused almost exclusively on the domestic context for Soviet ballet production, the production processes, and the kinds of ballets that resulted from those production processes in the Soviet Union, which were geared towards Soviet audiences. So toward the end of the period, my book project ends in 1960. Toward the end of that period, in the mid-1950s, the Soviet companies started to tour to the West, and they started to tour. They were already starting to tour to other parts of the world. So I am less of an expert on the reception of the touring productions, because that's not actually part of my research. I think that the reactions were mixed. The reactions tended to think that the dancers were quite extraordinary, but that the choreography was not much to speak about. And there was a little bit of sense that the ballet was political in the reception in the West. In sort of general reception, things like the New York Times or the critics in London when the Bolshoi Ballet first went to London. But there was more of a sense of this is different and it's weird and it's maybe over the top because the acting was very much more distinct in Soviet ballet. The actors, the dancers were more steeped in their characters than was common at the time in Western Europe and the United States. So the general reception was that this was a bit too much like silent film acting, and we don't like this in our ballet. Our ballet is not like it. In terms of the Russian ballet community in exile, there was a very large Russian ballet community in exile, but I haven't looked into that at all, so I can't speak to their particular reactions to the Soviet tours.
Okay, we have a question from Emily Wilcox, who thanks you for your fabulous research. And she says that I have been following the final bow for Yellowface project that seeks to transform classical ballets to remove racist portrayals of Asian characters. I'm wondering if you find it helpful to compare Soviet experts to make ballets that would convey values they supported and get rid of sexist or classical elements to these recent efforts to remove racism from ballet in the US context.
Yes, thank you, Emily. I do. I think those are very, very similar parallel projects. It's sort of complicated because I also have to admit that the portrayals of Asian characters, for example, in the ballet Red Poppy, were not that great. So I think the final bow for Yellowface people would say that the producers of the Red Poppy didn't do a very good job of removing the negative portrayals or the problematic portrayals of Asian characters in the Red Poppy, even though the producers of Red Poppy were trying to remove, like they were trying to be progressive, as you say. So yes, I do think those were entirely parallel projects that have, it's just complicated because it would seem like one of them failed completely.
Thank you. A reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. The next question comes from Greg Yost. This new Soviet ballet seems to have gotten started in the 1930s. Since ballet is a young person's dance, how did the dancers get trained in the 1920s? Was it too bourgeois to be taught in big cities in the early 20s and 30s?
Thank you. The pre-revolutionary in Russia before 1917, there were two imperial ballet schools, one in St. Petersburg and one in Moscow. And those ballet schools operated there was a little bit of an interruption around 1917, but basically those two ballet schools continued to operate. In the 1920s, there were an enormous number of private ballet schools and studios that sprung up especially in urban areas. And then later on in the 30s and 40s, there were a whole lot of new ballet schools. So where there were 2 government-sponsored ballet schools in 1917, there were at least 16 by the 1956, let's say. So the Soviet government invested in building ballet schools, not right away. The Civil War and there were a lot of things going on in the 1920s other than ballet education. So ballet education continued in the 2 pre-revolutionary schools, and it also expanded to these private studios. And the private studios sort of got closed down by the early 1930s, most of them. And the government started building more government schools in various cities, 1 in each republic, and also then quite a few more in Russia. Definitely not true bourgeois.
Thank you. The next question is from Lillian Thompson. Could you comment on ballet education at the Bolshoi Academy during the early Soviet period and on Soviet ballet during the World War? Is there something, what is the difference or the comparison?
Thank you. I'm very interested in ballet pedagogy. That's kind of how I got interested in Soviet ballet in general, is through Agrippina Vukanova's pedagogy. So my first project doesn't incorporate a lot about the ballet training. I looked into training at the Bolshoi Ballet, like the curriculum and the syllabi for various levels of ballet training and various levels of character dance training as part of my research. But they didn't, that information didn't make it into the book project. So the education definitely continued, and I think it's important to understand that there wasn't a sort of top-down curriculum that was imposed. There was a lot of creativity in the ballet school for the teachers who were there, that they had their own approaches to teaching in this period, and the kind of unified approach really emerged many decades later than I thought it was going to before I started this research. And during the Second World War, the ballet schools were evacuated. So training continued during the Second World War, but in different cities. The schools were separated from their theaters in some cases, and otherwise moved to be further away from the front lines. So ballet training definitely continued. New ballets were staged during the Second World War. And it's fascinating that the Soviet government invested in that, even while there was a world war going on and while there was such terrible destruction on Soviet territory and of Soviet lives, that this kind of training was not considered superfluous. It wasn't considered something that could be shut down during the war. It was continuing.
Our next comment is from Sergei Belenky, and he, like many others, congratulates Dr. Singh for an outstanding presentation. I'm not reading all the compliments, but they are numerous. And his question: don't you think that the formation of the Soviet ballet in terms of art for the people, in contrary to exclusive form of entertainment, goes earlier than the 1930s?
Yes. This chapter is expressly focused on the 1930s, but many of the themes in this chapter are building on ideas that were present in the 20s or even earlier. So it's not that these things were all new in the 1930s. It's that I wanted to dig into the sources for the discussions about ballet in the 1930s and see how these themes were being discussed at this point in time.
Our next question comes from Lisa Sundstrom. I was struck by the feminist tone of some of the arguments about female jumps in Soviet ballet. How long did that last? As far as you know, since we know that the Bolshevik feminist era was brief in general.
Thank you. Yes, the idea that ballet should be portraying strong heroines and that you could do this through the embodied dancing was something that continued. And it continued even as, in some cases, the heroines became less dramatically interesting in later Soviet productions. So even though the Bolshevik feminist movement pretty much ended in this 1930s period, it didn't last. The idea that ballet should represent strong Soviet women, or women as they should be, was something that continued all the way through the period that I study, which is ending in 1960.
Thanks. The next question comes from Michael Coates. Do you see much influence from the ideas of the Russian and Soviet avant-garde in these discussions, or had that mostly faded and was not a factor at this time?
There were mentions of avant-garde choreographers in the 1930s, but mostly as the negative examples of what people didn't want to do. So I would have to think further about the actual substance of the avant-garde theories and ideas about art, and whether those were sneaking into the discussions under some other guise, or whether, because the people who were speaking in the 1930s weren't saying, oh yes, we want to be avant-garde, we want to be like the avant-garde. That was definitely not happening. But it might be that some of those ideas came in under other sort of labels by then.
Our next question comes from Randolph Clark. In the 1950s, some artists defective. How does this relate to your work?
Most of the defections came from Leningrad. So my first project is exclusively about the Bolshoi theater, the history of the Bolshoi theater. And there were no defections in the 50s. I think actually the defections started later, a little bit later. The tour started in the 50s and the defections started later. But the defections, the famous ones, were coming from the Kirov theater in Leningrad, not from Moscow. So the historical actors in my study were not among the people who defected. They continued to work in the state academic Bolshoi theater.
Our next question, the questions just keep coming in from Lisa Kirschenbaum, and she also congratulates you for a great talk. Can you say some more about artists, how artists address the problem of accessibility? Was there an effort to make sure that audiences learned the desired lessons, that they understood ballet conventions or appreciated the dancer's expertise?
Thank you. Yes, the theaters did occasionally do surveys of audiences to see what audiences were making of ballets and operas. So ballet, and I'm going to talk about ballet and opera together, because the Bolshoi theater and most of the theaters in the Soviet Union were theaters of opera and ballet. So they had both genres going on. So the theaters would sometimes survey audiences to see what the audiences were learning. The problem for historians has been that while people like Pauline Thurklau and Michael Fowler and I have looked for these sources, looked for the results of these surveys, people's responses, or even the questionnaires, it's very hard to find them. I think a lot of the materials from the 30s were destroyed during World War II, or they've been lost. So I know that there were questions trying to get the audience's perceptions, trying to understand them. There were also what were called rabkori, the workers' correspondents would go and kind of talk to people in the audience and see what people in the audience were understanding. And then those rabkori would report back to the theater about what they had found, or they would write up the comments of the audience members and submit them to the theater. So there were these efforts, but not, I think, given the great investment that the government made in ballet and opera, the amount of attempting to see what the result, to evaluate the effectiveness of their investment, or the return on the investment, was rather small. So there was a lot of investment, not a lot of trying to see whether it was working. But yes, and so aside from sort of seeing what was there, the Bolshoi theater also engaged working class audiences, especially in the late 20s and early 30s, by taking works in progress to, say, factories, or bringing workers from a particular factory into the Bolshoi theater for dress rehearsal, and showing this ballet that was being produced and asking the workers what they thought. So there was this effort to engage working class audiences in that sense. And then also in the intermissions of operas, I found specifically, they had what were called workers' corners, where someone from the theater would try to explain the plot, or they would lead a discussion with audience members, or the designer would explain the designs, or a musicologist would talk about the music. So they had these little educational sessions during the intermissions, which were supposed to help audiences understand, audiences new to the theater to understand. And the Rob Corey reports from those workers' corners were overwhelmingly positive, that the workers did find this very useful and they appreciated the explanations. So yes, they did try to explain ballet and opera to audiences.
Okay, our next question comes from Vincent Bollinger. He again thanks you for this fascinating work that you're doing. He's intrigued by librettos that were rejected. And so first, were there rejections that took place at a later stage, once a ballet had been choreographed and staged? And secondly, I'm wondering whether you've encountered librettos being rejected during different times. Were rejections fairly consistent with just the rationales differing from politics as politics shifted, or were there rejections during the 30s and throughout the Stalin era?
Thank you. Yes, so ballets could be canceled once they had already been staged, or at any point in the process, they could be pulled. I made a conscious choice at the beginning of my research to focus on the ballets that were realized. So it happened that I came across this pile of rejection letters and these discussions of libretti. And so I managed to incorporate that material into this chapter. But overall, my research is on the ballets that were actually available for audiences. I was more interested in what ballets could be made, what ballets audiences were experiencing, than what ballets were prevented from, or audiences were prevented from seeing. So I can't speak to specific examples, but certainly there were ballets that were fully staged and produced and then pulled at dress rehearsal, or fully staged almost and pulled earlier. And they were pulled not only for problems with the libretto, I should say also that it could be problems with the music, it could be problems with the choreography, it could be problems with the design. There were other reasons for things being pulled other than just the libretti, if it got to a stage beyond all we have is the libretto. And then to the second question, I haven't found a trove of rejection letters like I found for the late 20s and early 30s for later periods. So I'm not sure what the justifications look like later on. I'm also not sure that there was as much attempting to solicit libretti later on as there was in the 1920s and the 1930s. The theater was really trying, the government was really trying to get people to submit libretti to make more ballets early on. And it happened that what they got quantity, but not quality. And so there was a lot of rejection then. I don't know if perhaps just the sheer number of libretti fell off later on as the labor of making libretti fell more squarely upon the professionals and less on kind of wide anyone who wants to try.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. Lee's being a good sport and answering these questions very precisely. The next question comes from Anna Liava, and she again compliments Lee on her research. And she has 2 questions. First, do you think Soviets were successfully able to transform Russian ballet into a socialist art form? And second, I would love to hear your opinion on ballet Taras Bulba and how the Soviet leadership responded to it.
Okay, well, I will say I've heard of Taras Bulba and I've seen some photographs, but I haven't looked into this ballet in particular. I know it was produced in different versions and there was an opera as well, but I can't speak to how the Soviet leadership responded to it or to any particular production today. I would love to look into that for future research project. To the first question, I do think that, I think certainly that ballet was transformed in the Soviet Union, that ballet during the Soviet period was different from ballet before. It was different from the Ballet Russe ballet. It was different from ballet at the imperial theaters in Russia before the revolutions. So I do think that it was transformed. I'm not And I also think that it was the idea that ballet could be educational for mass audiences, that it could be a way of inspiring people and channeling their enthusiasm toward what Soviet leaders considered to be positive work or positive ways of being a socialist citizen. I think it was successful in that sense. Having grown up in capitalist United States, I'm not sure that I can judge whether it was socialist or not, but the people in the discussions, the historical actors that I study, do seem to think that ballet belonged in the Soviet Union, it belonged in socialist culture, and that it could have this potential to inspire mass audiences and focus their attention in positive ways.
Next question comes from Eva Chow, who thanks you for your fascinating talk. And she has one question on the subject matter for socialist ballets. You list the 4 subjects. The last one, literary sources, seems incongruent with the other 3. Seems like slipping into elite literature. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Literature was very important in Soviet culture. Socialist realism was basically defined in terms of literary practice, and then other genres, artists had to figure out how to make it in their own practice. So the idea that literature, Pushkin and Shakespeare, those were supposed to be the property of mass audiences in the Soviet Union. The Soviet leaders identified themselves as the people who brought these important cultural products to mass audiences. So Pushkin was widely celebrated. His death anniversary in 1937 was a huge affair. Shakespeare was really big in dramatic theaters in the 1930s, and the ballets came a little bit later based on Shakespeare plays. But I don't think it's incongruous insofar as Soviet culture really emphasized literature, both classical literature as well as new Soviet literature. So it's interesting that in ballet, most of the literary sources were classical literature, not Soviet literature. In opera, there was quite a bit of opera production based on new Soviet novels and new Soviet literature. But I don't think it was incongruous to people at the time because of the incredible push to get everyone in the Soviet Union to know Pushkin and love Shakespeare.
Okay, I'm going to go to the last 3 questions, and you can answer them as much or as little as you want. The first question is, have you noticed transformation of characters in classic ballet? The second one is, were any of these dancers Jewish? And finally, Elizabeth Owen asks whether you have a background in dance, performing or studying ballet that prompted your interest in this area of research. So
can I also take the one about mime at the top?
Please do.
It's disappeared. Okay, on the subject of mime, that was something that I cut out of this talk to make the time shorter. So yes, there was an incredible antagonism against pantomime that was prominent in the Petrova era. And there was, in the 1930s, there were discussions about, okay, we definitely need to get rid of the ballet mime from the 19th century, but we don't know now, what do we do? So do we tell stories with dance? So people thought, well, maybe eventually we'll tell stories with dance, but now we can't. So for the meantime, until we figure out how to tell stories through dance, let's replace the pantomime with new gestures. So there was this development of a kind of more quotidian ballet mime vocabulary in the Soviet period that by the end of the 1950s got kind of, it was no longer needed because they were able to tell stories with dance. So in the 1930s, there was definitely antagonism toward 19th century ballet mime and an effort to replace it with more realistic pantomime that then got replaced by dancing the stories. And then on the question of my background, yes, I studied ballet in college especially, and I learned about the pedagogy of Agripina Vaganova, and that is how I got into this area of research.
Okay, well, Dr. Singh has been very generous with her time and her answers, but we're going to bring this conversation to a close. I want to thank Dr. Singh And I want to thank the State Department's Title VIII program for allowing us to support the work of such scholars as Dr. Singh. Please visit our website to keep up to date with all of our publications. And thank you for joining us.